We're certainly in a strange position after our first encounter with Heidegger. Famously, Niels Bohr, the physicist, talking with Werner Heisenberg, and as you'll remember, they pioneered what's called the Copenhagen theory of mechanics and quantum mechanics. Bohr said to Heisenberg, you could be clear or you could be accurate. But if you're clear, you wouldn't be accurate, and if you're accurate, you wouldn't be clear. Now, I told you that Heidegger was controversial, and a lot of people thought that he did one better than that. He was neither clear nor accurate. And if you'll remember, Heidegger says we've got to figure out what this thing philosophy is. Let's not even assume that we know what it is. We've got to realize that we are not even aware that there could be a question of the meaning of being. And if you remember, Heidegger also gave a famous lecture which was about the nothing. He told his colleagues he wanted to talk about nothing. Well, maybe many people have it right to say he said nothing, and that would give us a better understanding of what in some ways looks at least to be a scramble in his thinking. But Heidegger said something else as well. Heidegger said that people are actually correct when they say that you can't do anything with philosophy. They're right about that. Where they're wrong is they fail to ask the next question. Even though you can't do something with philosophy, is it possible philosophy might do something with you? Consider a lot of what Heidegger does as an attack on the tradition and an attempt to untangle it and get it to realize that it's dealing with abstractions and false problems. Heidegger claims that the appropriate posture for human beings is something he calls openness to being, by which he can be taken to mean a concern over the dwindling of meaning in our human situation in our time. And for Heidegger, that time was largely the 20th century from about the 1920s on. Openness to being for Heidegger, whatever the philosophy books might say about it, on Heidegger's view was an openness to the experience that we were out of touch with and we could not see or experience in any significant way meaning. What Heidegger thought was that Nietzsche was both right and wrong. Metaphorically speaking, when Nietzsche said God was dead, Heidegger thought Nietzsche, in at least a metaphorical sense, had that right. But Heidegger also thought in important ways Nietzsche was wrong, because Nietzsche's solution to the death of God, so-called, Nietzsche's solution to the notion that there was no other world, was to seek out individuals, unique individuals who could be courageous, who could embrace life and be creative. And Heidegger does not see that as the route to take. You're not going to have agency, the great potential doer who will create things. Again, Heidegger thinks what we have to do is find a way to undergo, not to do, but to undergo. And what we have to undergo in our time is the absence of meaning. Heidegger's historical interpretation claims that our pre-Socratic ancestors, those people that existed many centuries ago, even before Socrates, were enthralled. They were in awe over the emergence of things into presence. This wonder and amazement allowed these ancestors of ours to be enchanted and to give themselves over to caring for things in their being. Platonic philosophy, if Heidegger is right, disrupted this enthralled, amazed, wondrous engagement by intellectualizing it, by making us not so much creatures who could be in awe of the world around us, but as creatures who, rather than looking at the world with that awe, came to intellectualize and rationalize, and even to look beyond the world, as if there was something there that was unchanging. On Heidegger's view, this formalism, this rationalism, this failure of awe in this emphasis on reason could only lead over time, as our history unfolded, it could only lead over time to an agenda that attempts to control and manipulate the world around us to our ends. Heidegger makes the dramatic claim that if you start with Western philosophy, you're going to end up with technology. And ending up with technology will turn out not just to be progress, better things for better living. It will end up as a kind of tyrant over our life in the world. He thought that if you started the way Western philosophy took its turn in Plato, that what you'd end up doing would be using your desires as instruments to extract the power inherent in things and use that power for very anthropomorphic human ends, to use things in a way that will divest them of their enchanting features. What Heidegger thought is if you start the way rationalism began, what you'd end up doing is strip mining the very meaning of things. After a series of stages of this devolution, Heidegger claims that we've arrived at a time where what is fundamental is the absence of meaning, a kind of underlying emptiness. Our era, if he is correct, is one of multiple short-lived satisfactions, but nothing in the way of fulfillment, nothing in the way of anything that would transform, enhance, transmute, and uplift us. Fulfillment would require at least three orientations to be taken up and sustained, if Heidegger has this right. This underlying absence of meaning, this void, this emptiness, would need to be recognized. Thus, there would be a movement from denying and not letting oneself comprehend that there is a void around us, to allowing ourselves what might be the painful experience of the presence of an emptiness, of something missing. Not one particular something, but in a general sense, some underlying void. Remember, I told you that Heidegger gave this famous or infamous lecture about the nothing. Let me dwell on that for a minute. The lecture about the nothing was an attempt to open people to the possibility that something was missing, but whatever it was that was missing, you couldn't say that it was a specific something. It was something that you could have a sense of if you opened yourself to it. But opening yourself to something that he first called the nothing, and he sometimes called absence, well, how would you bring people to do that? And as you can imagine, a lot of people saw Heidegger in this respect as not only inscrutable, but when you could understand him, a little bit on the morbid side. I mean, could it be that what we need to have happen to us in our time is that we open ourselves to the strange experience of something missing, but we have no idea what it could be? I mean, is it possible that though we don't know what philosophy is, therefore don't know whether we could use it to pursue meaning, nonetheless it might do something with us or to us? You can see how Heidegger had to be incredibly controversial. Now, this direct experience of an underlying groundlessness and emptiness to human life and its supportive environments would have to be endured, Heidegger thought, not denied, not evaded. And one had to discover it and face up to it and experience it. In fact, he says that there has to be a resoluteness. The German word is Entschlossenheit, and that would be required, and that we'd be without any guarantee of any positive outcome if we were able to develop that, but we had to develop it. Is there something missing? Is there an emptiness to human life? Is it possible that we will need a certain resolute, open-minded, confronting of something that we cannot name, and that strangely we would have to say we don't understand what it is, and part of what we have to understand is that whatever it is, it's missing? Surely this is strange. It's oracular. Should we allow that to speak to us? Our questions about the meaning of life requiring that we go through a corridor in which our fundamental experience is that there's something not there, we know not what. Heidegger alludes to unusual and quite non-contemporary world settings, unusual settings, that suggest the kind of world and thus the kind of enchantment that we've lost. Because do remember, he thinks if you start with Western philosophy, you end with technology, but the underlying meaning of technology will be to strip mine meaning from the world. So what he has to do in part is give us some sense of what might be lost, what might have happened, what might not be here now that once was here. And his two famous examples are a Greek temple and the peasant shoes that belong to an old rural woman. Heidegger's account of the ancient temple is an account of something that for him represents a locus and an orientation point that drew people together and defined for themselves in terms of their cycles and relations to one another. Pause and think about this for a moment. Do you know a place where people can and do come together and have a sense that in that place they are not only together, but share a common meaning? Heidegger says progressively we are living in a world where that is no longer possible. Churches are places that tourists go through and take pictures. Political events are less the sorts of events that draw enthralled crowds to look to those political circumstances for opportunity to make a better world. Largely these sorts of things, were Heidegger right, have become empty, not places where real meaning would be found. Is it nostalgia on Heidegger's part? Is it Heidegger's imagination? Heidegger thinks that once upon a time, maybe it's a world that never was. Maybe it's the way things never were. There was and were places where people would gather, be drawn, and in some magnetic way be connected and be opened to something beyond them. What Heidegger tells us is that these places, at least once upon a time, he's accused of telling stories about the way things never were. Once upon a time, such places were experienced as veiling the presence of a God. And one of the great problems about understanding Heidegger is he's very good in not telling us quite what he means by a God or the gods. Heidegger's notion of the gods is highly problematic and most probably metaphorical. It most probably refers to some kind of mysterious and magnetic presence. A God for Heidegger is most likely that which is experienced as in some way transcendent of our understanding, as something can draw us humans to it, not on our terms, but on its terms. And for Heidegger, the temple always is construed as arising out of something he calls earth. That is, it's grounded in something specific. but it's also construed as protecting humans from the bruteness and the dangers of the indifferently natural world and its indifferent environment. Heidegger also makes reference to a pair of peasant shoes, supposedly those of an old woman. In fact, he does this by reference to a painting by the Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh. And Heidegger reflects in his writings on this pair of peasant shoes. And what he tells us, now how could he say this in any knowing way? Is he just telling us a story? He tells us that through looking at these shoes in the painting, we can be drawn into a simpler world, maybe even a more primitive one, where the sophistications, the cosmopolitan dimensions, the complications of life are not present. There's a kind of simple life cycle. Yes, anxiety, worry about the crops, worries about births and deaths, but not sophistication and complication. The world of the peasant woman is understood, he thinks, by her, but of course she doesn't exist. It's a pair of shoes and a Van Gogh painting. Understood by her as Heidegger wants us to understand this story, as connecting her, making her very connected in a practical, non-reflective way. This account that Heidegger gives is very resemblant to Heidegger's own Black Forest life. There's a sharp contrast between the kind of life Heidegger had and the sophisticated cosmopolitan life of the city. I'd like to tell you a little about that and dwell for a moment on it. It's been said by philosophers that you're only fully human in a city. Think of a city a little bit metaphorically. And if you're not living in the city, or a city, you're either a beast or a god. And most of the time, and it's part of academic life, academics get drawn to universities that, in a kind of broad sense, are cosmopolitan centers. Heidegger himself, who came to be offered a position in philosophy in Berlin, as Hegel was, and Hegel took the position, Heidegger himself was offered such a position and turned it down. He chose to live his life in the Black Forest in southwestern Germany. He chose to live in a little hut in the Black Forest, come down to teach his classes, and occasionally to give a public lecture. Those who sneered at him said that he always phoned down and made sure there was enough in the way of folding chairs in the auditorium before he came down. But he wore lederhosen and he wore German costumes, not costumes, but German peasant dress. And he thought that you had to be rooted in the soil. And he was born in this part of Germany. And when he was offered the job at Berlin, he famously said that he sat near an old man and told the old man of this offer to go to the big time, so to speak. And the old man said nothing. This word nothing keeps coming up in our conversation. But this is Heidegger's account of it. The old man said nothing. Nothing. And Heidegger got up and left and said, I get the message. Heidegger remained in the Black Forest. Heidegger did not go to Berlin. And again, part of this was Heidegger's sense that if you're going to develop a sense of the mystery of life, what you have to do is stay apart and outside the loud noise of the world. Heidegger does stress the great capacity art has to reveal different worlds of experience and open perspectives for us on alternatives, and perhaps for us to discover altogether lost kinds of lives that might play into what a genuine life could be for us as individuals. But just as Heidegger says that philosophy must happen to you, and remember, at this point we still don't know, and Heidegger tells us we don't know what philosophy is, Heidegger also says that art must happen to us. Art can reveal, but it has to happen to us. We cannot simply go out and experience it. What Heidegger probably has in mind as much as anything is whether it could again happen that we could have an experience of awe. Because he worries, as I indicated before, and I'll linger with you on this another minute, he thinks that part of the problem we have in not getting any sense that there's a question about the meaning of being, part of the problem we have in not understanding what even the word being means, not even having an interest in finding out, part of the problem is that without our realizing it, our horizon has been constricted, and it's been constricted by the way technology, in the name of progress, in the name of speed, in the name of productivity, has actually just as much boxed us in as it has provided us future opportunities. But let's continue along this line, this brooding Heideggerian line. Heidegger claims that meaning has manifested itself in different ways through the history of the West, and that its manifestation in our time, as I've said before, has primarily been through an uncomprehended absence or emptiness, but he quickly comes to say that what it is also, as the presence and the circumstance of our time, is one of pervasive instrumental technology. That is the box in which we've come to be. Heidegger claims that meaning and human beings have a mutual need for each other. It isn't that we create meaning. That's kind of a Nietzschean notion. It isn't that meaning comes down to us with qualifications. That is a kind of a Kierkegaardian notion. We have to do a lot along the way, but God gives grace to us. It is Heidegger's view that meaning needs us. Now that's a strange statement. And that we need meaning. We don't create meaning. At the same time, meaning doesn't manifest itself out of the blue and plunge in to us. How can we understand this? He is saying that, yes, ours is a technological age, and that something more than just our human decisions are going to be required in this age to make it the best world that we can. He also says that technology is more than simply instrumentalism, and that actually technology is a trap, not just instruments, but also a trap. What he next tells us is that being itself, and do we yet know even what we mean by that word? Is it God? Does Heidegger mean by being the absolute spirit that Hegel says unfolds? What does Heidegger mean by it? Whatever he means by it, and he tells us that he's got to find a way to get us to get concerned about it and open to it, Heidegger says that it's withholding itself from us in our time. It has absented itself from us. And a consequence of this, he says, is that as a compensation, we extract energy of various forms from wherever we can find it, whether natural resources, whether capital, whatever kinds of worldly things, we stockpile them, and we do that as a compensation for some underlying something missing that needs us, we need it, and to discover how we can be brought together with it is the fundamental problem. On Heidegger's account, we turn a dehumanizing, very dehumanizing corner when we view ourselves as resources more than as people. And he thinks the ultimate upshot of technology is that we will turn out to view ourselves more and more also as resources rather than people. And rather than seeing us as an openness through which meaning might be manifested, what we come to do more and more is see ourselves as biological creatures who, through biotechnological and medical means, which looked like miracles before and become possibilities now, we view ourselves as biological objects that in principle over time, as agents with instrumental knowledge, can make of ourselves and the world anything we want. And what Heidegger wants somehow to do is to rekindle in us and give us an appreciation for what our true human place is in the world. And he gives us about 4 or 5 ways in which we can honestly view our place in the world. He thinks we should see ourselves as shepherds. And in fact, one of the stories he tells is the following: that once upon a time, care, yes, the very word care, but embodied as a god, was walking along a river and saw a particular piece of earth. And it shaped that piece of earth. And after shaping it, Jupiter came along and got into an argument with Care as to what to call this shaped piece of earth. And they argued for some time, and then Saturn came along. Saturn is the god of time. And Saturn listened to the argument and resolved the dispute, and resolved it in this way. Saturn, the god of time, and that means time will tell and time has told. Saturn said, Jupiter, since you gave this creature spirit, you will have its spirit after its death. And Earth, since it's your substance from which it came, you shall have its body after its death. But Care, since you first formed this creature, you shall have it as long as it lives. Now, as to its name, we will call it man, because it comes from humus, earth. So Heidegger says we should reflect on that notion and see that what we are as humans, if we could understand ourselves to our depths, is beings, part of whose underlying meaning is to care. And to care, in a way, is to be a shepherd. Heidegger tells us that we are living more and more in a world where we only count as real what moves fast and can be held in both hands, but that we have to realize that time grows in hidden places, and that sometimes we have to wait for the right time. And it is his continuing claim that ours is not a time for action, it's a time for openness. It is not a time to be an agent, it is time to be open in such a way that we can fully allow ourselves the experience of an absence we hope someday will come to life as a new presence. Earlier I said that Heidegger said that philosophy can do something with us. And what he thinks it can do with us is to get us once again to see that the question of what life means is genuine, but that we have probably come in a quiet way not to allow ourselves to realize how genuine that question is. That's because technology has boxed us in. That's because we are living more and more in a world of ordinariness. We talk a lot because we have little to say. We eat a lot though we're not hungry. We buy a lot even though there's nothing we think really is worth purchasing. At least that's Heidegger's analysis, and he thinks that's the case because there's underlying it all something missing. And most of our activities in the world are attempted compensations for that something being missing. So if we were to capture it in a few sentences, it would be, let's admit that there are voids. Let us endure them. Let us not avoid them. Do not avoid the voids. We'll talk more about Heidegger in our next lecture. We can't avoid doing it.